Welcome to the second season of Beyond Generations, an interview series. It's my journey of discovering what happened to Japanese American people during World War II and how people have been trying to acknowledge, understand, and learn from it and figure out how to connect it to the future. I am your host, Monica. Today's guest is Jay Rubin. He is the author of a novel, The Sun Gods, a story about a Caucasian boy and his adopted Japanese mother, whose lives were separated at the mercy of World War II. The story takes you to Seattle, to Camp Minidoka, and to Japan. Jay Rubin is also one of the most distinguished English language translators of Japanese literature. In this episode, Jay will talk about how he got interested in studying Japanese, how his moving to Seattle made him start working on this novel, and how crucial it was for him to have a deep experience with the Japanese language and people to write this story.
I went to the University of Chicago for my BA, and that's where I first encountered Japanese classes. I had no plan to study Japanese. I had no particular interest in Japan, but I just happened to take a course. I had an open quarter, and I could take something. I was probably going to major in philosophy or English. I hadn't quite decided, but I had a free quarter to study something, and decided I would do a course in something non-Western. And that particular quarter, there was a course, an introductory course in Japanese literature available. So I took that almost by chance. I was interested in literature in general, so I wanted to take this course on Japanese literature. And I was quite amazed by it. I really enjoyed it tremendously, and I think the teacher was awfully good, the professor, and he hooked me by bringing we of course, all the students were reading in English. I mean, it was for people who didn't know any Japanese, and we were reading everything in English. But he would bring the the Japanese text with him every time he came to class. And of course, he would bring the English text that we were reading, but he would bring the Japanese, and he would talk about what was happening in the Japanese text. And he would talk about how different the translation was from the original. And I was kind of fascinated by that. And I very much got the idea from him that if I could read these things in the original Japanese, it would be much, much better than reading it in somebody's English translation. So that's really good. That's really what hooked me. That was in the spring of my second year of college, and I started studying Japanese language on my own in the summer, and then started taking courses in Japanese from him and other people for the next 2 years of my undergraduate career, and ruined my whole education by spending all my time learning how to say, "Can you tell me where the bathroom is?" and other kind of everyday phrases like that, and never recovered from that.
I was going to ask you how you got interested in Japanese culture, including Japanese language.
Well, that was it. That's what started. It was very definitely the language, the appeal of the language and the literature, or how the language works in the literature, that got me interested. So my experience of Japan is very much a language experience. It's the joy of functioning in a foreign language, a very foreign language. I didn't know a word of Japanese until I started studying it, and it was just so strange to me and so fascinating. When I went to the country, there were lots of experiences that were not just language connected. Um, Food, for one thing, was was a revelation. And then I met a very important person in my life and got involved with her. And she's still she's still my wife. And so the experience of Japan has had lots of different aspects for me. But language was very definitely the most attractive thing to me, the thing that really made me feel that I was able to have a totally new experience in my brain that would not have been possible any other way. Virtually anything you say in Japanese is expressed differently from the way it's expressed in English. Konnichiwa is nothing like hello. Arigatou gozaimasu is nothing like thank you if you translate it literally. Everything is different. Everything is expressed differently. In the textbooks, they tell you that arigatou gozaimasu means thank you, but it doesn't literally mean thank you. You know, arigatou, for one thing, is an adverb, and
ありがたい。
yeah, arigatou gozaimasu. You put an adverb and you put a form of a verb meaning to exist after it, and it's totally crazy. It really is.
It's crazy because you think about it. As a Japanese person myself, I don't think about it.
Of course not. Yeah, no. Why should you?
So your encounter, like how you got interested in Japanese culture, including Japanese language, was a serendipity.
Yeah, because that same quarter there was a course on Chinese history available, and I could have taken that. I was just going to take something probably Asian, certainly non-Western, and it could have been Chinese history, but I figured, well, it might be fun to read literary works in Japanese. I mean, that were written in Japanese. I can't read them in Japanese at that point, but
Yeah. So you're talking about your fascination for the Japanese language, and also one of the things you're well known for is that you have translated works of a Japanese author Haruki Murakami's. But today, I want to ask you about your own novel. This novel, The Sun Gods. Tell us about this novel, The Sun Gods. What is it about?
What is it about? That's a good question. I would say it's a story of a blonde young man from Seattle who's about to graduate from a local Christian college and enter missionary work, but he feels compelled, first of all, to examine the strange, dark memories he has from early childhood that involve unknown Japanese people. They're people he doesn't know why he has these images in his head of well, he doesn't even know they're Japanese. They're some kind of Asian people, and he knows that he had some kind of experience involving Asian people, probably Japanese, and he somehow senses that there was a woman there who was a kind of mother to him, but he doesn't know who she was. And the more he finds out about his past, the more it puts him in conflict with his girlfriend and with his father. His father's a minister. You know, he comes from a very Christian background. He's going to a Christian college, and his father has raised him to be a believing Christian. And finally, this fellow, the protagonist of the novel, embarks on a search that entirely changes the direction of his life. I guess I can identify with that because Japanese entirely changed the direction of my life. It changes the direction of his life. It tests his faith, and finally his faith does not survive the test. He crossed the Pacific. He goes to Japan, and where he's looking for her, and it turns out that her fate and his fate hinged on America's use of the atomic bomb. That comes to be a large part of her story and their story, and all of this comes as a great surprise to him. But it's a search for the facts of things, and I think what he comes to learn first of all is how hypocritical the American government was in its claims of justice and equality for all people.
Okay, thank you. I'll get to some questions about the content of the book, but before that, let me ask you about your motivation to write this book.
My Japanese literature professor in Chicago, who first mentioned the camps to me, there are a couple of pages in the book where the man that the protagonist meets says, oh, of course, you must know about the camps, and he doesn't know anything about the camps. That's very much reflecting my experience with my professor. He said, oh, of course, you know about the camps during World War II, where all the Japanese Americans from the West Coast were locked up. And I said, I don't know anything about that. It was a total shock to me. And that must have been in 1965 or so. And I started to read about it. You know, I wanted to find out what this was about. So I started to read about some of the experience that happened, and I didn't really pursue it that much. For a long time, I felt that whatever was Japanese American was irrelevant to whatever work I was doing. I was working on Japanese literature written in Japanese in Japan for Japanese readers, and that had nothing to do with the Japanese American experience. I think it was moving to Seattle that got me to wake up a little more. There's one of those things that dawned on me slowly. I think I identified more with the Japanese Americans because because I had such a long and deep experience with the Japanese language and people. But then we moved to Seattle in 1975, and I started meeting people who had actually been in Minidoka. Usually Japanese, usually people from Seattle were sent to Minidoka in Idaho, and meeting people who were actually locked up, people who had this experience or knew people who had that experience. Their parents were, and this was. Let's see, when we came in 1975, it really was about the time that people started to talk about this thing. You know, there was a long period from 1945, the end of the war, to right to the 1970s, when people preferred to put it out of their minds, preferred not to speak of the shame of having been locked up. There was a long period where there was virtually no talk about the camps, and the Sansei, the third generation Americans, are the ones who started asking their parents and grandparents, wait a minute, why were you born out there in Idaho somewhere, or that kind of thing? What was that all about? And it was a revelation to them too. The Sansei started learning about the trauma that their parents and grandparents had gone through, having been shipped out of their homes and sent out to the desert. So right around that time is when they started having things like days of remembrance. I think we attended we attended the first Day of Remembrance in Seattle. So I believe that first Day of Remembrance took place in Puyallup. That meeting of people, of hearing more directly from people who were involved in it, got us. My wife and I were both kind of shocked and amazed and angry about what we learned, and decided to write a novel. Not a factual account of this, because by then there were several factual books that you could read about the camps. I wanted to write something that had a more sense of the feeling of what it was like to be locked up. I put a lot of energy into researching the camps and researching life there. There was a wonderful resource book called Minidoka Interlude, which had pictures of the people that were there and descriptions of the hospital and other places. So I really was able to use that. And I was able to use the camp newspaper, something called the Minidoka Irrigator, which had it was primarily an English language paper. Of course, it was in America, but they had a page or two of Japanese text also. So I spent a lot of time reading from that newspaper. There was the complete run of that newspaper was available in the University of Washington Library in the special collections. So I learned a lot about just everyday life in the camps and what people were experiencing then. The death of an old man who went out into the desert to try to find wood to carve, and he died in the cold. And there was a shooting that was described in the newspapers. There were some really awful things that went on, and then there were dances and beauty contests and all kinds of things. There were descriptions of the development of schools. The people tried their best, and they did an excellent job, I think. The people who were locked up in these camps were trying to recreate ordinary life. I learned a lot about that from the Minidoka Irrigator and Minidoka Interlude, that kind of a yearbook that is still available. In fact, I just saw an ad for it. I think they have reproduced it, and I believe it's for sale now. I got it. I got it from a library. I know it's available in the Seattle Central Library. They have one or two copies there. Quite fascinating.
You have just said that you put a lot of energy to describe how it was like to live in the camp, and I really felt that. I felt how stinky it was by reading your novel, how stinky it was. This protagonist, the Billy, always talked about how smelly it was in the stables. And
Yeah.
also, you have just mentioned that this old guy who went out to find a scrap wood piece to do some carving, he died, and he got frozen to death, and his body was this very hard, bent shape
Mm-hmm.
when
Mm-hmm.
he was brought back. By reading those detailed descriptions, detailed stories, helps you understand how it was like living in the camps. It's not just, oh, it was cold. I understand you put a lot of effort in describing those things. I believe you do not have anybody in your family who were sent to the Japanese American incarceration camps during the war. And you're not Japanese American.
No,
And
hardly.
right, yeah, I can see that. So some may argue that, oh, you're not Japanese American. You do not have anybody in your family who were sent to camps. How do you understand? How can you write about it if you do not have anybody? How would you argue back?
That's a good question. Well, one thing, I didn't write it by myself. I wrote it with my Japanese wife, and so she added that aspect. The two of us would take our walks and talk about the book, for hours, and it was a great joint experience. I did kind of expect some negative feedback from Japanese Americans. Once I brought the book out, I thought I might hear negative criticism from people, exactly what you're saying, because there's a lot of racial consciousness in this country that might reach conclusions of that sort. And but I've had nothing but good feedback from the Japanese American community here. There are people, I've talked to people who were in the camps or who were very closely connected with that, and I've never once gotten any sense of resentment that I'm uh, a presumptuous white guy who can't know about these things. Never once. I've gotten some very good feedback from people who had the experience and said, this is just like what it was. I've had a lot of very, very good sense that that I haven't gotten this kind of negativity. It was quite gratifying to me that the book has been accepted on its own terms without questioning uh, whether or not I have the qualifications to write about things Japanese. I'm not sure why. Maybe my wife and I did a good job on it, and nobody felt that it was not authentic. I tried to make it as authentic as possible, both in the sense of recreating experiences that I read about in the newspapers. There were I deliberately wrote about. I was trying to dramatize events that I read about, say, like the Seattle blackout. There was the day after Pearl Harbor on December 8th, 1941. There was a blackout in Seattle, and I tried to recreate that and the chaos that resulted and the destruction of lights. When all the lights went out at midnight or 11 or whenever it was, when all the lights went out, some of the lights didn't go out, so the crowd would throw stones and break lights because they wanted cooperation with the blackout. The removal of the Bainbridge Islanders that happened on March 30th, 1942. They were the first people to be removed from their homes in this country. I did a lot of reading about them and also looking into there was a footbridge that came from the ferry terminal onto Marion Street, which unfortunately has now been torn down just in the last couple of years. That this old bridge was up there for all this time, and it was possible to go and see the bridge where the crowd was standing and watching the people who were brought over from Bainbridge Island. They were up on that bridge. The bridge was just overflowing with people. So it was really quite a challenge to describe that day. And then they were brought over on the ferry and they were loaded onto trains and sent away. Another event on April 28th of 1942, the Seattle Japanese were bused to Puyallup, to the so-called Assembly Center, the Camp Harmony, they called it. So all of those things were actual events that I tried to work into into the description.
So what is the most important message you want to convey through this novel, this story?
Well, I think all the stuff that we've been talking about, I wanted it to be to teach people about the camps who didn't know anything. Especially on the East Coast, there's very little knowledge that the camps ever happened. Even now, you have perfectly well-educated people who have never heard of that. That's why I was very careful to make things historically accurate. I tried to make everything as accurate as I could. I've never gotten a single bit of feedback saying this is wrong. So I think at least that was successful. I think I got most of the historical events correct. Say, as I say, like the busing out of the Japanese on April 28th, 1942. All those things that I could pin down and find descriptions in the newspaper. I use those sources. Out here, people know more because there was more trauma here.
Through this book, you want to educate people. What happened?
Well, I did very definitely have an intention of teaching Americans about this whole experience, and not just the experience of the camps, but also the war and the bombing of Nagasaki, which I think Americans have very little appreciation for what their bombs do to other people. And so that there's a chapter near the end of the book that describes the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, which I hoped readers would be horrified by. It's meant to be horrifying because it's a fairly detailed description of what it was like in Nagasaki. And of course, that was based on my reading both in Japanese sources and in books about the atomic bomb. Americans are used to sending their bombs out to other people's countries and letting them fall there. They're not used to being bombed, and they don't know too much about what these bombs can do. So I thought that was one thing I wanted to work into the book.
So this book is not just about the incarceration, but more about the evil of wars in general.
The evil of war, the evil of racism. There was very definitely. I don't think they would have dropped that bomb on white people. I think that's mentioned. I think that's voiced in the book somewhere. I think somebody says that I don't know. I can't. I think that's not. I don't think it's a coincidence that the one country that we bombed was a non-white country.
So you have just mentioned about the racism, and one important theme of this novel is, of course, racism, racial discrimination. And if another important theme of this novel, if there is, I think it's an issue of religion, like faith, because I felt that I was challenged to think about faith and organized religion when I was reading your novel. Did you intend it?
Yes, that was one of my purposes. I have a strong sense that there's a great deal of hypocrisy involved. That's why the hypocrisy is a central theme of the book, both of the hypocrisy of the American ideals, which were not lived up to, the political and social ideals that were not lived up to, but also this is another area that I expected to get negative feedback about, that, when I show Christians in this book not living up to their Christianity, but going along with the violence of the bomb and so forth. I thought I was going to get negative feedback there, and I've gotten a couple of Christians saying to me, I felt embarrassed. I felt ashamed. I was a little surprised. I felt ashamed of what was done. Now, not everybody was like Pastor Tom, that the father of the protagonist, who was a minister who betrayed his wife finally. Whoops, I'm giving away maybe too much plot, but it's funny, when we were doing research for the book, we went down to the Japanese Baptist church on Broadway in South Seattle, and learned a lot about the church. The churches were the central organizational body for the community before the war, and they still are very important. We saw photographs outside the church, and there were photographs of outings like picnics and things. There's a big picnic scene in the book, and it's modeled after what they did in this church. They would go out to Jackson Park or one of the other parks and have church picnics. And one of the clergymen who was in the pictures was a tall white guy. Everybody with these Japanese pretty much of uniform height, and then there was this tall white guy in the picture, and I said, well, who is this guy? And it turned out to be Reverend Emory Andrews, who was the English language pastor for the Japanese Baptist Church. And so we went into the church, and we got all kinds of booklets and informational papers and things about the church, and we learned about Emory Andrews and what a wonderful guy he was. When all of his congregation was sent off to Minidoka, he moved his family out there into Idaho, and they lived out there for 2 or 3 years in order that he could minister to his people there in the camp. He performed weddings, he performed funerals, he drove back and forth to Seattle, picking up things that some of the people were sorry that they left in Seattle. He would bring to them. He was quite an amazing guy. He was quite devoted to his congregation. But he's the model for Pastor Tom. We decided, when we saw this white pastor in among the Japanese congregation, we had to write not a book about all good people, but one bad guy. And we had to have a white bad guy who betrayed his congregation, and because you can't write interesting fiction about good people. There has to be somebody bad in there. And so, strangely enough, one of the best, Emory Andrews appears in the book 2 or 3 times as Emory Andrews, and he is the good guy that he was in real life. But he also became the model for the pastor who becomes the symbol of American hypocrisy and betrayal of the Japanese. That was part of the the process of discovery. We had no idea who this guy was when we went down to the church, and no idea how we were going to include him in the book. But it was interesting to find out after we had been writing for several months that Pastor Tom was the one that we wanted to concentrate on, but also we wanted to get Emory Andrews into the book too, because he was really such a faithful member of the Christian community.
Yeah, that Reverend Andrews you have just mentioned, I thought you were really fair in depicting how the Americans were before the war, during the war, because you not only made a character of Pastor Tom, who betrayed his congregation, who betrayed his wife, maybe his son as well, Billy as well, but also you talked about Reverend Andrews, and also was it Miss Mahon of Bailey Gatzard School?
She was obviously a wonderful person. She would preach to her children in the school about how they had to be loyal Americans and good Americans and get along with each other, not just the Japanese, but the Chinese and the white. And she was really a model for the best of American values. She appears a little bit. She's in the scene depicting the departure of the Japanese on the bus to Puyallup, and she's crying.
Yeah. So you said that the biggest theme of this novel is hypocrisy.
That's what I think. What do you think?
Yeah. So as I said, there are two important themes, mainly racial discrimination and an issue of religion, faith. And I was wondering how they intersect.
Yeah. Well, I think finally it's an affirmation of the meaning of life through love rather than through belief in supernatural gods. It's an affirmation of the human experience with love at the center, rather than just blind belief in gods. Did you bring some kind of religious values to the book when you were reading it, and find them challenged?
I went to missionary school as a kid, and not my conclusion, but my observation has been that there are good people who are religious, and also there are not so good people who are religious at the same time. And reading your novel kind of endorses my observation, because as I said, there is a reverend like Tom and also reverend like Andrews. So it's not about religion, it's about who you are. And also what Mitsuko does, clapping to the sun. I don't do that, but I see some people, especially older people, do that, showing their gratitude, appreciation to the sun, giving us one day, another day, a new day. It's not a religion. It's a gratitude, maybe reverence.
Absolutely.
I totally understand it. And then, do you want to explain that in the context of the title, The Sun Gods?
Well, the sun gods, it's a little bit tongue in cheek because this is the sister Yoshiko who has been through this terrible experience, and she's come back to Japan, and she tells her worship is not traditional Japanese Shinto. It's she makes a statement that the the only real gods are the sun gods, and a new one comes into existence every day. I made that up. It's another way of affirming the kind of gratitude and reverence towards daily experience.
Just like you described in the scene in the novel where Billy and his friend David and then the wife and his wife and the child went to Meiji Shrine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not like representing all the Japanese people in Japan, not everybody, but for a lot of people, going to a shrine and pray is it's not a religion. It's
No.
sense of like showing appreciation to whoever the existence who is higher than you are.
I enjoyed creating that scene at the Meiji Shrine in which Billy suddenly realizes that the little boy he has on his shoulders is a holy infant like Jesus. You know, he's holy, he's divine because he's human. He's not he's not uh, he's not supernatural. And Billy suddenly realizes that is where the value is. That's where the holiness of life is. And that sort of goes along with the sun god's idea that each day has a potential, at least, for being a deep, almost religious experience, just simply in its meaning. That's what gives it meaning, not made up gods. And there's a lot of anger in the book with regard to both religious and political hypocrisy, but also in the end, finally, it's an affirmation of another way of finding meaning in life, and that is through love, which he does find in the end. I shouldn't even give away that much, but I think it has a positive ending, and it has a lot to do with love rather than blind faith in supernatural gods.
The Sun Gods is about hypocrisy, political, social, and religious. Jay reveals this American hypocrisy by meticulously accurate accounts of historical events, including the incarceration of Japanese American people during World War II. He depicts feelings of people who went through these events with empathy and authenticity. That is why reading The Sun Gods not only teaches you historical facts, it speaks to your heart. It almost hurts. It horrifies you. Yet it gives you hope. The kind of hope you can find when you sense the wonder of being and see miracles in everyday life and everyone's life. What miracle did you find today? Special thanks to Jay Rubin, the author of The Sun Gods, and Rakuko Rubin. Music by Zakar Balaha. This is Monica. You have been listening to Beyond Generations. My journey of discovery will continue.